I often say that conflict is the highest form of intimacy.
Yeah.
And that's really where you start to understand who is your community, is when we disagree, when we differ, when we don't understand each other, when we sometimes lose compassion or misalign around certain ideas. I think that those are the points and places where poetry then becomes the extent at which we are willing to lean in.
Your work is so grounded in community organizing. And I think that community organizing means mostly listening. And so then I was just thinking about the expression of experience. And when you're listening and you have all of these individual experiences coming to you and forming a collective, like let's say you're writing about pain, becomes a collective pain, but it's made up of all these individual voices. And how do they feed into your voice? And is there a line? And how does poetry happen?
Well, I think poetry is, and then you happen, perhaps. I mean, there are people that I think usually think that poetry is this solitary act, that you sit alone in a room. And while I value the ability to like have space to create and to hear your thoughts and to, you know, to sit with self and reflect and be introspective, I don't think that being in community makes you any less introspective. So for me, growing up in the city was a very communal experience. I think you feel there's expansiveness in terms of how far you can reach, where your community extends. I mean, clearly there's your block, there's your family, there's your block, there's your neighborhood. But New Yorkers are very much, they own being New Yorkers, and they own all parts of New York, you know, with a sense of enthusiasm. And I think that's because of the rich cultural tradition around communal living and all the crosswires and diverse sort of experimentations that come out of having people from all over be together and have to learn how to make meaning out of the difference, that the difference is not necessarily separatism, but that the difference is a place where we intersect and collide, but often combust into something far greater than what we were in our individual pursuits.
This is how I make the case for a lot of the music that I'm involved with is, well, there are a few things in my head right now. The community can be the clear and present physical community, but it's also this like community made up of history, right? It's all of everything that's ever fed into this thing. And I do think that in music, and I think in poetry too, as you say, the discord is as valuable as the resolution. I mean, that's what music is. It passes through dissonance and consonance, right? And maybe it's the only place that you can experience that within a framework of whatever we want to call it, beauty, truth, art. It made me think also about this question of inspiration and how I think people do misinterpret the making of poetry, the making of music as this sacred space where you go into, you know, your little room and inspiration comes. But really, I think the little room is where you go so that everything that has come at you and to you and into you can become clarified, crystallized, expressed in whatever you are making that day.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily the space where to be in spirit comes, because I think inspiration is to be with spirit, in spirit. So to me, it's like you have to be present at all times, because inspiration doesn't just, you know, dawn on you because you have the nice desk and the perfect pencil and the great room with the beautiful view. I will say that there are certain things that one can do to like to heighten your senses or your skill for, I would say, active listening. You know, you learn to listen a certain way because you pay attention to the nuance of how someone's doing a thing, and there's a level of curiosity and investment in, what's that sound?
Yeah.
What is that sound, and what is it doing? How is it doing that? And then I think New York was a place for me that had so many sounds that people just wrote off as noise.
Yeah.
And didn't really understand the musicality of that, which is actually a whole other conversation. Brings me to a whole other thing. But I recently had a situation with neighbors complaining about noise, making noise complaints. And it's a big point of contention between Black communities and communities of other cultures and understandings. But you often find that a lot of the times when Black people have the police called on them, it's like a noise complaint. It's one of the few reasons the police get called on our communities. And so I started reading up about it, and it really is fascinating to me, the cultural, disconnect around sound and relationship to sound, and the entitlement and idea of a sort of sense of, entitlement for silence.
Yes,
that
right.
Silence is some sacred, golden frontier of value.
Well, it's about ownership.
Yeah, and control.
Right.
It's a different kind of perspective when you grow up around sound, and sound being so much a part of how you engage your curiosity, your compassion, your sense of community. It's how you learn. It's a language. It's a form of, it's a form of identity. So I think
you go through different phases or degrees of listening all day. And I think it's true. Probably most people riding the train in New York City want to shut out that sound. It's a processing thing, right? So it turns into noise. But if you engaged with that, now you're hearing people.
It's like the idea that because I don't understand it or I don't know it, it's just noise, But rather than leaning into what you don't know and what you don't understand and being curious, what would have been like if my neighbor had come up and knocked on the door and said, "What's that you're listening to?"
Right.
Because it's really keeping me up right now.
Yeah.
But why are you listening to it right now at this time in the morning? What is it doing for you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's oftentimes a lot of our conflicts are really sites of profound intimacy. It's a place where we can truly be curious about each other. And I think rather than being curious and sort of inviting the inquiry, sometimes we just resort to violence and extreme judgment, which is oftentimes placed out of fear.
Yeah.
Of not knowing, of it not being normal, of it not being what you're used to. But then you think about being in the womb, and none of us were in the womb being like, "Mom, shut it up out there,"
Trying to sleep.
cut it out.
Yeah.
You figured a way with her rhythm.
Yes.
You found a way
Yeah.
to be in tune with her rhythm, and it's lovely if she could sit around in a little quiet room with nursery rhymes on her belly all day. But for many of us, our mothers were working.
Yeah.
They were, some of them still partying. They need busy ways of experience. And my friend and I talk about this that's like submarine sounds. It's
Yes, right.
being submerged in the fluids of the body. And what is the sound of the body? How does that inform who you become?
Right.
And how you perceive sound, how you perceive music, the way of, by virtue of that, your relationship to life.
And we were talking earlier, and I am feeling right now acutely, because I lost my mom, it's 4 months ago. And so you lose, that plane of being in communion with someone. And what I'm realizing now is that, it is all of the, if you want to call it memory, and not even necessarily lived memory, it's all of the things that made you, and to open yourself up to all of those voices and experiences and stories and journeys expands you.
Oh, yeah. You're, she's here in your cheekbones.
Yeah.
She's in your laughter. She's in, the memories that you have, but also in the ways that you continue to be.
Yeah.
that's really part of that's the hardest part to kind of contend with sometimes, because you don't even realize how much you are the extension of someone until they're gone, you know.
And not just someone, but her great-grandmother
Oh,
too,
yeah.
right?
I was just gonna
whom
say.
I know nothing. But now I have to realize that this lineage, like these ties are strong.
Yeah. Like I lost, as you know, my grandmother today. And this morning I was thinking about the fact that they say that you're like all of her granddaughters are like in, or all of her daughter and me. I was basically in her belly, you know, before
Yes.
my mom was even born.
Right.
That I was already a thought in her body, you know, and that that's wild. Like, because it's also exactly what we're saying, you know, what are the sounds that I still carry from her womb, you know, and the wombs that came before her.
Yes.
It's like, you think about it as like a very esoteric, metaphorical thing, but it's like really literal. It's like practical. I was in her body. I mean, my grandmother was a frightening woman. People were not, she intimidated a lot of people. But we, all of us, for better or worse, we benefited off of that, you know, off of those struggles, those triumphs, those many ways of kind of having to navigate the conditions and the time period that she had to navigate as a woman, which made it possible for me to be who I am now.
I did want to ask you about something that I noticed. I feel like you are very intentional about definitions, defining yourself. And I know that that's really important because words are important. And I'm curious about, you know, the experiences that you've had, because you operate in many different spaces and you're also bringing those spaces together.
That part.
Right? Yeah. So I guess both on a practical level, just being able to do what you want to do in your professional and creative world, but also understanding for yourself what it is that you're doing, right?
Yeah.
These definitions do become important.
Well, I feel like I hate definitions for the most part. I despise them.
Yeah.
But I find that it is important to know what words mean.
Yeah.
Not because they inherently only and solely mean that, but because intention, tonality, all these things matter. And if we both are not in agreement about what the word is, then we actually don't understand each other. We're talking in circles at that point. So for me, like, you know, I get to the point where I get frustrated because I think people assume that we're all saying the same thing when we say poet.
Right.
Or that we're all saying the same thing when we say black woman, or when we all say the same thing when we say, so like sometimes people will throw kind of titles and brackets at you, and you're like, do you even know who I am? You clearly don't understand who I am. And so then I have to push back with, well, let's go with this. Because then it's like not as easy for you to define. I've been pushing back on people. I've been resenting the term activist. I've been resenting the term spoken word poet. I've been, you know, resenting the term that people can, like, the notion that like I'm only talking about black joy or black femininity or black love or black, I'm like, just because I care about black people doesn't mean that that's all. I care about humanity.
Right.
But I'm speaking from a very specific entry point and experience. And yes, I love black people. Yes, I want to see equality for black people. But that means I want equality for you too, whether you're black or not, you know. The premise is that because I'm speaking to people I love, that somehow it's excluding the range and the scope of humanity, which is like really a failure of language. It's a failure of people's imaginations and their ability to understand that multiple things can exist at once. And that's where my frustration often comes from definitions, you know.
No. I see it really clearly. I understand it very clearly.
Yeah.
I was just talking last night with a friend about genre in music and what do we do with these words anymore. And it's a very delicate balance between wanting to embrace and honor the heritage that caused that definition in the first place. You know, we're talking about jazz or the blues or, you know, whatever it is. And also to move away from a space where assumptions come with that and where you're allowed also to be fluid. Yeah, but I see that. And what is the problem? The problem is that one definition has come through time of what a poet is, and that's not what you are. And also, it is controlling your own narrative.
Well, if it depends on whose definition of poet and where the origin of that story started and where it's come. You know, like poet was never a literary practice. It was always an oral tradition, and the printing press is fairly new invention. So it's who gets to decide what a poet is, and how do we determine the value of what a poet is doing and what is effective in their work. It's how we arrange our ideas about ourselves. And so, like, what are the words that you continue to rehearse in your head about your life and your story and how you come to know yourself and who you are? Those words have power, and they sit with you, and they have a certain kind of frequency. And so you become what you recite. And then there's language that we have and experience without words, you know. There's so much that range for the human experience that is wordless.
Yeah, well, that's the music. I just want to ask you one thing about this new song.
Oh.
Do we call it a song? Do we call it a poem?
Yeah,
poem,
it's a
song?
poem song? Song poem? Song-oem?
For the kids.
Yeah.
Which is very heart exploding. And I realized I was listening to it, and I was also revisiting the Langston Hughes poem that it is responding to.
Yeah.
For the kids who died is his poem, and yours is intentionally for the kids who live. And I realized something about, well, language history, our what we're taught and what we are trying to change, and just very much at the meta level. I think that his poem, which is written in the 1930s, is continuing this, language and message from always about, like, someday things will change, right? And one of these days, and that if we keep hoping and being better, then the thing will change, the world will change. And then you take that and you absolutely flip it, and you put the power into these kids.
Yeah.
Do you remember the last lines of the poem?
Awestruck and unafraid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, that is a very powerful change of language. It's small and it's everything.
I mean, all across the globe, you know, that children have had to bear the brunt of a lot of our failures as adults to just reconcile really trivial conflicts that are rooted in greed and, you know, exploitation of land, of people, of rights. And I think that's also the strangeness of Langston's poem, is that there are some truths about the human condition that will always kind of, I think, you know, cause us to have deep frustrations, but also we are sometimes not that bad as humans. And so I think that poem for the kids who live is was my way of trying to say, wow, this is still relevant, but how do we, I don't want it to be relevant. I don't want Langston's poem, which is fairly a very morbid title, for the kids who die. I don't want that to be something we're still reciting 10, 15, 20 years from now. Tomorrow, I don't even want it to be the case. So how do I manifest, how do I embody and, like, declare what it ought to be? And it's for the kids who live, and they will live, and we will be sure of it. so long as we continue to embody the values, of the things we claim we want to see,
Yeah. Well, this is where I know that you don't want to be called an activist with a capital A, nor do I. And we all got called that a lot in the last few years. But I do think that's, what this is when you can. So basically, you're embracing history, right? You're taking something that's almost 100 years old, that poem.
Yeah.
And you are letting it flow through you and adjusting it and looking at the future of it, because I think that poem of his holds a lot of past.
Yeah. So I'm not sure a poem can do what is necessary and required of this time, but I will do my best to continue to struggle with those things called words,